I'd like to call the standing. Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment to order officially. My name is Robert Hawkins. I am the MLA for Yellowknife Centre and the chair of the Standing Committee. Today, we will be receiving a briefing from the officials representing the Tlicho government in regards to the regulatory framework for land and water use permitting. This briefing is part of committee's ongoing project to review regulatory framework, evaluating the underlying processes and requirements and their interpretation by all parties. And ultimately, our hope is to make recommendations on how the GNWT can improve the administration, efficiency, and effectiveness of the regulatory framework. Please note this meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media website, and as always, I have no doubt we have millions of viewers subscribing and holding onto every word and every moment of our presentation with great enthusiasm. I will now quickly run through members just for efficiency for attendance, and I'll note that we have Ms. Oh my goodness, I drew a blank. Ms. Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North, Mr. Julian Morris, MLA for Frame Lake, Ms. Kate Reeb, MLA for Great Slave, and as mentioned, I'm Robert Hawkins. I'll now pass over to our presenters, and it's my understanding we have Ms. Steinwan, if I say it correctly, Deschambault online, and I believe she is the lead presenter, so maybe I'll start with her if she can hear fine. You're welcome to introduce your witnesses, and as such, I will return to you, unless directed otherwise, for the presentation as it's being led through the process. And lastly, is just a gentle reminder, in the context of politeness and efficiency, of course, all questions and processes have to go through the chair. It's for recording purposes, and the mic follows the speaker, so if you're speaking and providing comment and it's not on mic, it didn't happen. That said, I go to Ms. Steinwan Deschambault, if I'm saying it correctly. If you would, please.
Okay. Just a minute, I need to put my phone on mute, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, merci, everyone. So merci for inviting us to present to you as part of your review of the land and water permitting framework in the Mackenzie Valley. The land and water in Mokuigora Denitla is so important to us, and how it has managed effects of culture and way of life, and affects our ability to participate in the economy and to be self-sufficient as Indigenous people. My name is Tammy Steinwan Deschambault. I am the Tlicho Government Director of the Department of Culture and Lands Protection. With me co-presenting to you today is Intwa Scott Enns. Intwa is the Director of the Department of Planning and Partnerships. I believe Intwa is there with you.
Yes, both her and Mr. Wheeler, yes.
Okay, great, must see. Okay, now I'll pass it over to Intwa.
Merci, Tammy. Tammy and I will be going back and forth this morning throughout the presentation, so we'll just coordinate between ourselves. Komaro Hoizi, si Intwa Scott NCA, Director Planning Partnerships, Tlicho Dekawu Egalada. My name is Itwa Scott Enns, Director of Planning and Partnerships for Tlicho Government, and we are here on behalf of Tlicho Government, Tammy and I, and we're also joined by Brett Weller, who is the Senior Advisor of Sustainability Land and Resource Management. And Violet Kamso-Blondin is also with Tammy, and she is the Regulatory Manager for the Department of Lands and Culture Protection. So Tlicho Government is a regional self-government. As you guys know, we have 4 communities and 3 boundaries defined in the Tlicho Agreement. We are coming up on 20 years since the Tlicho Agreement has been in effect, so we'll be celebrating 20 years next year in 2025. The Tlicho Constitution is our highest law. outlines the purpose of Tlicho government, which is essentially to take care of the land, our citizens, our language, our culture, and our way of life. We have through tripartite agreement, so the Tlicho agreement is signed by Canada, GNWT, and us as the Tlicho. And it provides certainty respects of rights of the Tlicho relating to land, resources, and governance. We also have Chapter 26, which focuses on economic measures in the Tlicho agreement. And so the Chapter 26 has two objectives. One is to strengthen and maintain the Tlicho traditional economy, and the other is to promote Tlicho self-sufficiency. And that chapter is a really important one for Tlicho government. It's been a priority of us, mandated and directed by our leaders in recent years to ensure that that chapter is implemented. So in addition to the other chapters focused on co-management, we're also really looking at the ways that we implement the chapter on economic measures. For us, socioeconomic well-being and the idea of balance is really important. Every 4 years, our leaders go through a priority setting process at the outset of our new assembly, similar to you guys. And so back in 2021, our leaders did that, and there's a document we have called the Strategic Intentions, which outlines some of the priorities that the leaders have directed to Tlicho government until next year. And so within that document, you'll see that there's strong emphasis both on taking care of the land, protecting our language, culture, way of life, and promoting economic self-sufficiency. I'll turn it over to Tammy.
Okay, merci. So within TG, I represent the Department of Culture and Lands Protection, which has responsibilities for land, water, wildlife, research, and revitalization of language and culture. DCLP's mandate includes several items specifically related to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, and the review of the regulatory framework. So protection of Tlicho and traditional territory in relation to land, water, environment. Our regulatory manager, Violet Kamso-Blondin, and her team participate in all regulatory reviews for mining, mineral exploration, and other projects that may have impacts and benefits within Mokuiko Denite. Like Intwa stated, everything that we do is related to our people and their well-being, especially related to lands, water, wildlife, which we heavily depend on. We also review GNWT land leases, mineral claims, and other leases. We participate in about 200 reviews per year, plus any policy, guideline, regulation, and legislative processes. Merci. On to Intwa.
Oh, there's two on. So the Department of Planning and Partnerships, my department is responsible for a few key areas, some of which is intergovernmental relations. So I manage all of the various intergovernmental forums as well as at the leadership level, including the Intergovernmental Council, which I co-lead with DCLP. Legislative development processes, and so we look very closely at how we collaborate with other governments on legislation, policy, regulation development, and then tracking implementation of the Tlicho agreement. And then I'm also responsible for negotiation of agreements, partnerships with industry is part of my work as well, around impact and benefit agreements and our government planning process. So our regulatory system that's established through the Tlicho agreement is embedded in our treaty, and the treaty is protected by the Canadian Constitution. So that's really important, I think, to emphasize is the significance of what that means to have something established through treaty. Every person who works for every single one of all three of our governments, Tlicho government, GNWT, and the government of Canada, have a responsibility to uphold that. So we do need to make sure that any of the work that we're doing when it comes to the regulatory system, any ideas we bring forward is thought through very carefully to consider how it is upholding those treaty obligations and not adding confusion or duplication. The principles of our co-management system are really fundamental to what we're talking about today. And Tammy's going to speak a little bit more about this in a minute. But the way that we implement it, the operations can be flexible. There's always areas for improvement, and we're happy to talk about what some of those concrete areas are today. But at the foundation of what it is and why we established co-management and why that was so important to our people when we negotiated our treaty is unwavered and has to be protected, upheld, and we're happy to look at how operations can be flexible and adjust, but we want to make sure that the principles of co-management, the participation of Tlicho in making decisions is protected. So we understand that you're here to talk about the review of the regulatory framework for land and water use permitting under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act and its operational effectiveness, and looking at particular interest in how GNWT can provide further supports, make changes where needed, and improve the effectiveness of our regulatory process. So today we want to talk a bit about some of the really targeted areas where we see that you can do that and provide some ideas from Tlicho government's perspective about how that could happen. And we understand it's not related to the federally coordinated MVRMA review and not expected to have implications for that work. Go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, when we talk about our resource management system and the regulatory framework for land and water permitting, we also need to remember where it comes from and why it was designed the way it is. During the modern treaty negotiations, the Indigenous and public government sat down and considered how land and water would be managed. It is through these discussions that they decided to create independent decision-making boards with board members appointed equally from Indigenous and public governments. In the Tlicho Agreement, this resulted in the creation of the Wik-Éjé Co-Management Area and the Wik-Éjé Land and Water Board. The central purpose of our treaty-based system is to ensure Tlicho participation, Tlicho values, and decision-making are included. And more broadly, the system was set up so that Indigenous people and residents of each region can participate in decisions that affect us. It's also designed to avoid problems of the past when public government had full authority, which resulted in problems like Kolomak, Ray Rock, Giant Mine, where there was huge damage to the land and great disrespect for the treaties and the rights of Indigenous people of the land. This new system recognizes the basic Indigenous right to self-determination on traditional lands, and it sets out the fundamental principles to guide land and water regulation. Next slide, please. These core principles that were established by the treaty partners together do a few things. So in co-management is about who makes the decisions. And it means that no one government unilaterally decides what happens on our shared lands. Co-management is a constitutionally mandated right under modern treaties. It is operationalized in part through the land and water boards. Number two, the objective that guides decision-making. It is to provide for the conservation and development of land and water for the optimum benefit of, first and foremost, the residents of the region. For example, within the Wik-Éjé region, as outlined in the map that we just saw. Number three, another core principle is the holistic scope. The regulatory framework requires consideration of the whole environment, the land, the water, wildlife, people, including the socioeconomic and cultural environment, consideration of traditional knowledge, and the well-being and way of life of Indigenous people. When looking at things holistically, all parts have equal importance. It's important to maintain that balance. Next slide, please. So under the umbrella of these core principles, there's implementation, which has a number of approaches that can be taken and adjustments can be made, mostly left to legislation, regulations, and board practice. Also includes process standards like reasonableness and administrative fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, etc. There's flexibility, and it increases as you go from legislation to regulations to policies to case-by-case approaches based on the specific issue being considered. Now, within this framework of fundamental principles and flexible operations, we will discuss some challenges and opportunities. Next slide, please, and Intwa will continue.
So our co-management system was in place well before devolution, and the devolution gave GNWT administration and control over public lands, but not ultimate responsibility for land and resource management, because that already existed. It already was in place through the co-management systems created through our treaties. So every square inch of the Northwest Territories is Indigenous people's lands. The Premier has acknowledged that, and I know that's well understood in the NWT. So the GNWT is administering those lands in trust for Indigenous peoples. I think it's important to point out that the way that the GNWT implements devolution and starts looking at how they fulfill those responsibilities through the devolution agreement for administration of public lands must not duplicate or interfere in our co-management systems, overreach over the decisions of our boards. We know that there's instances and concerns about duplication, about overreach, and we've heard some of those examples shared by the Chamber of Mines, I think, to this committee recently. And so we want to make sure that the board's decisions are respected, that they're upheld, that they're followed. They are an independent tribunal. They are an institution of public government. They're very responsible. They don't make their decisions lightly. And they consider many inputs and the visions of different governments in the work that they do. They also have a mandate not just to regulate, but also to achieve balance. In the board's mandate is about achieving optimum benefit. And so I think it's important to point out in the existing board's mandates, the way they operate, the way they make decisions, that piece around achieving balance, around looking at how we achieve economic sustainability for the whole of the territory is embedded within that. And I can tell you that's what keeps those decision makers up at night. I literally just heard from my mom, who used to be the chair of the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board, that kept her up at night when she was the chair. And it keeps the board members up at night because it's their family members who are affected when mines close and there's no jobs. They know firsthand the significance of where we're at right now as the NWT economy is on decline, and the importance of making sure that there's economic opportunities for our people, for our families, for future generations, while at the same time taking care of the land and fulfilling those responsibilities we have as Tlicho to protect and maintain our culture, land, and way of life. So I really want to emphasize that the way that those decisions are made at the board level, all of that thinking is embedded already. It's not missing from the way that they operate, and so that's not a gap that needs to be filled through the establishment and potential duplication of regulations or government policy.
Okay, next slide, please. For more than 15 years, the Northwest Territories Resource Management System has been under some sort of review or revision. We have a world-class regulatory system based on modern treaties and co-management with open and transparent processes and evidence-based decision-making. We do not need fundamental changes. Unfortunately, all those reviews and attempted revisions have distracted us from doing the kind of basic maintenance work on our land and water regulations that should be standard regulatory practice. We have some regulatory requirements that are outdated or simply unclear. We need communication and education for people unfamiliar with our treaty-based co-management system. It is part of our shared responsibility to help developers navigate the regulatory process. Also to debunk myths, deconstruct generalizations, and get the facts out there. So some implications with the regulatory burden with no environmental or other benefit. This is a misalignment of the operations with the core principles and objectives. Remember that the objectives is to have balance, optimum benefit, not to waste our time and scare off developers by arguing amongst ourselves or tying ourselves in knots trying to implement outdated requirements. Sometimes there's also lost time and resources, so resources spent on legal and other areas, resources to interpret unclear regulatory clauses. This slows down permitting, wastes a lot of time and money. There's also missed opportunities, unnecessary overregulation, and lost time and or lost resources mean missed opportunities for everyone. If companies decide not to invest or miss seasonal operation windows, if licenses take too long or processes are disrupted due to misunderstandings of regulatory requirements and definitions, these all add up to missed opportunities. Next slide, please, and I'll hand it over to Intwa.
We have really good collaboration, intergovernmental collaboration as governments. When Tlicho government goes to talk to other governments in other forums, we always point to what we do here at the NWT, in particular at IGC, around the legislative development protocols and now the legislative process convention, because that's really unheard of anywhere else in the world. Like, it really is impressive and something to be proud of and something to protect and continue improving. We have really good, I think, working relationships at the tables. And because of that, we've been able to achieve some important milestones. Last year, the Forest Act was passed 1 year ago. And that was the first time that legislation was passed, not just under the collaborative legislative development protocols, but also under the new Legislative Assembly Process Convention. And so that opened the door for us as Indigenous governments to not just work with the GNWT staff at the IGC level on legislative development, but also with you as the Assembly to ensure that legislation passes through the legislature with Indigenous government input, involvement, and support every step of the way. So I really feel like, you know, in any of the work that we have moving forward, we do have really good precedents and best practices and opportunities to continue collaborating on how we continue to improve our collaboration on economic development and taking care of the land together.
Okay, next slide, please. The second big opportunity is for all of us to really embrace our system, support, embrace, empower our regulators. These institutions of public government set up through the modern treaties are our co-management boards. They don't work for TG, they don't work for Government of the Northwest Territories. They work for their constitutionally mandated objectives with a focus on optimum benefit for residents using transparent and evidence-based processes. We have tools to direct how regulators work, appointments, policy direction, and legislative instruction following the words and spirit and intent of our treaty. But the value decisions are up to the board members appointed by Indigenous and public governments. We must not intentionally or by accident duplicate or replace this with unelected administrative processes from within the GNWT. We don't need more layers of overlapping regulation. It's not the place of one treaty partner or one government to try to dictate to the others or to override co-management decisions based on their own different set of objectives. Next slide, please.
there's a really immediate opportunity that we can point to for improvement, and that's on the water regulations. We've already heard from industry that there are many inefficiencies and there's not always the clarity that's needed in those regulations. And so as Tlicho government, we've been asking for updates to the water regulations because we see that there are several areas where just improving clarity and consistency in the water regs will streamline things for industry as well. We don't want to get bogged down in doing a full review of the water regulations. We're talking about really targeted, specific review of sections that we know will have concrete impact for what we're talking about. And so I'm sure there's many areas within the regulations that we could start like playing with, but what we really want is think about where we can improve efficiency for mining and exploration companies so that we're not wasting our time trying to interpret and review sections that are not clear, and it's just clear for everyone involved. So, for example, there's schedules in the regulations that set specific regulatory requirements for activities like mining, oil, gas, municipal governments, etc., but missing is mineral exploration, one of the most common activities permitted within the Mackenzie Valley. There's many ambiguities in the regulations that could be addressed. There's unclear requirements on water use for water roads, ice bridges, water circulation to keep drills from freezing, when to require type A license with a longer process and predetermined public hearings. So we're not talking about whether or not to regulate those activities. They're already regulated. But as Tammy said, we're just talking about how many layers of regulations do we want, what is the cost benefit, and when specifically should a water license be required. There needs to be balance of flexibility and certainty. Leave the boards lots of flexibility to set the appropriate process and level of regulation based on evidence for each project. That's what their expertise is in. But provide clarity of definitions and certainty around what level of regulation is intended for mineral exploration in general. Tammy?
Okay, next slide, please. So we have a world-class system for land and water regulation based on principles of co-management and balance to achieve the optimum benefit for Indigenous people and Northerners. Continuous improvement, we have established processes like the NWT environmental audit to help us identify what to focus on. We are never going to be perfect, but we can take action to make improvements whenever opportunities arise or when we learn of gaps. If we keep our principles front and center and work together, we can protect the environment, avoid duplication, use our resources efficiently, and support socioeconomic well-being. Operationally, we have a lot of flexibility to work with. Next slide, please.
Treaties.
Into
Our systems are based on modern treaties. GNWT Indigenous governments need to continue to work together as partners. We really need those fundamental principles of our treaties to be upheld, and also for those principles and values to be informing every piece of work that GNWT leads, every step down the chain and down the way, down into the bureaucracies, down to the technical work that the departments lead. Our GNWT's commitment to that needs to be deep and unwavering, cutting across all levels of legislative assembly, cabinet, and at the bureaucratic level. We need to make sure that we avoid duplication and that these are diligently implemented across every department and level of government. Operationally, there's something concrete that GNWT can do immediately. Begin work with the Intergovernmental Council on targeted amendments to the Waters Act regulations to improve clarity and support economic sustainability, self-sufficiency in the North as part of a balanced economy. And there's one more point that I wanted to bring up that we've been dealing with very recently, which is around board appointments. So that's another area around, there's collaborative processes around board appointments, and having our board members in place for each of the regulatory boards and co-management boards is so critical in order for them to operate, have quorum, and make the important decisions to fulfill their mandates to support economic balance and taking care of the land and waters and our resources. But those processes really get hindered by bureaucratic and administrative process, both I think at all levels of government. And so we really urge another area for GNWT to look into is to look at how they can ensure efficiency in their board appointment process and diligence in following up to ensure that any nominees they put forward is getting through even the federal systems. There's been times where TG has had to step in to advocate to ensure that board appointments are getting processed. And so I think that's something that we could improve on working on together, that GNWT is also being as diligent, ensuring that those board appointments are being processed, that they're starting sooner so that we don't have gaps like we do currently on the Wekiji Land and Water Board. Merci. I think that concludes our
Merci.
presentation. Merci, Cho.
Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciated. First off, I'll just say that a lot of effort was brought to help us understand your process, how it was established, why it's brought into place and into play in the context of certainly its values and meaning and direction. So, one of the committee's goals, and I don't necessarily try to, I'm not trying to say it from an academic point of view, but in the sense of just generally speaking, our project is really intended to look at things like, for example, how is the process working? Is it reasonable? Is it meaningful? Is it efficient? And is it in our wheelhouse? Of course, we can't make, we can always make recommendations, but the fact is we have limited ability to make recommendations outside of the scope of the NWT government. So. But that said, often we'll hear things like, for example, dual processes that could actually be running at the same time. And it's not a question of the value of the process, it's just the efficiency of the process. Could they overlap or dovetail together in a more reasonable manner? So in other words, why do consultation twice when you can just expand the question just a little bit further and do consultation once in the sense of cost and efficiency and whatnot? So your presentation did capture some of those questions that we're struggling with, which is what's your experience around challenges, not to take away from the system, but to make it work maybe the way it was intended and without causing unnecessary delay. I look to committee members. Does anyone have any questions we'd like to present to our presenters? I see a couple hands, and we'll see where we take it from there. MLA Morris, if you would lead us off, and then I'll go to MLA Moore.
Okay, thank you. First of all, just a big thanks to the TG for making time to come and speak with us. I've really been looking forward to your presentation in particular, and really feel, I was excited to hear what you guys had to say with regards to this review. So, to get into questions, I was wondering if we could get a bit more into specifics. There was a few times in the presentation where you were talking about layers of overlapping regulation or places where you feel GNWT process is overlapping with co-management process and you think there's room for efficiency there. So I think it's really important for us in our review to be targeted about what we're looking at, targeted at what we could change about how the GNWT is working in the system. So if you can speak to specifics, I think that would be really helpful. So that's my first question.
Thank you for that. So I'm just going to pause and find out who I send the questions to, if it's going to, or where I should start. Ms. Scott Enns, are you going to start?
Sure.
Why don't I always start with you, and then we can take it from there. So, again, recording in public purposes if we're not on the right mic, etc. So
Yes,
please,
yes,
Ms. Scott
no problem.
Enns.
I will start and then probably I'll turn to Brett to add more, unless Tammy would like to also add. So, thank you for that question, Julian. I think there are different areas that come up where we're kind of trying to protect against that duplication and that overreach. Right now, we're working on the regulation development both for Public Lands Act regulations and the Mineral Resource Act regulations through technical working groups under the Intergovernmental Council. One specific area that has been ongoing in discussion is around reclamation and the setting of securities, making sure that the decisions made by our boards on that area is respected, upheld, and not that there's not opportunity for that to be overridden by G&WT. And I think there's a few other areas that Brett could probably speak to.
Okay, thank you. Mr., is it Weller? Wheeler? Okay, and we do have mic control, like we have an IT person, so. Nope. I mean, you're welcome to push your buttons, but our specific ones on the table, we have more than competent staff that will take care of it. So, Mr. Wheeler? That's correct, please.
Okay. Merci, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and merci, Julian, for the question. There are a few examples that I think we had in mind as a team, and that, like Tlicho said, have been kind of working with or sort of becoming increasingly aware of over like the last few years. One of them is around the issue of land leases and G&WT's approach to the land lease process, the application and review process, and also to the types of conditions that G&WT considers including in land leases. So, yeah, and I think, you know, we just feel like it's really counterproductive to have these land tendering instruments like leases try to regulate on top of some of the same things that are the same environmental conditions, the same reclamation requirements that are the responsibility of the co-management boards already under the treaties and under the MVRMA. So that's kind of like I think the biggest piece and sort of like the summary of where that duplication. And so it's not automatic that the duplication happens, but there's potential for it to happen. It depends on the approach. So I think Miss Claudine Lee spoke about one example when the Chamber of Mines were here about, you know, having a project that went through environmental assessment and approval by all governments, including G&WT ministers, and they went through water licensing and a whole decision-making process by the boards and public and evidence, and this was a multi-year process. And then at the end of that, she described another multi-year process from what, I don't know the details of it, but just what she described, of working out conditions for the land lease or the land tenure instrument for a project that was already approved through these other two levels. So that's one example. We've also seen examples at the Tlicho rare earth project where duplicative and kind of open-ended requirements around reclamation that were included as conditions in the land lease and the surface lease. Again, after already there have been applications and reviews and approvals through the co-management boards and their responsibility for regulating all uses of land and all uses of water. That process had been done, but then there was another condition included in the land lease that said, you know, reclamation has to be done to the satisfaction of the minister, period. No, you know, what reclamation requirements have already been looked at sort of line by line. You know, you need to move certain amounts of rock, you need to cover certain things up, you need to take garbage off site, and how much all those things cost. And that was looked at through the Land and Water Board process, and requirements that were specific were set. And the company explained that it was very challenging for them from a project planning and from an investment perspective to have this open-ended condition. They didn't know what standard they were going to be held to, but there was a condition in their lease that, you know, they would have to deal with in addition to these other more specific requirements that had already been set. So I think so that's the main one that we're worried about or sort of watchful about. We want to make sure that there's not like regulatory creep in terms of adding more conditions or adding duplicative conditions into the land leases when the land use is already supposed to be regulated. And yeah, like Tammy said, like treaty partners got down together and said, how are we going to deal with land use and water use and deposits of waste? And as well, we're going to create these boards that are independent, and we'll appoint members to be on them, and they'll be institutions of public government and have to look out for the optimum benefit and things like that. So it's that's an example, I think, of where there's not a gap, And so there's other areas where there are gaps where we would welcome more leadership from GNWT to work with us. For example, on the relinquishment process, or like what happens at the end of a reclaimed and closed mine. There's no process for that or certainty around that right now. And that's something that I think would be a good place for GNWT to lead and work with us still. We should always work together, but that is sort of just try to make a distinction between what's like a real gap and what's already covered and doesn't need another layer of regulations. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That was very specific and very helpful in the sense of the challenge, what we're doing, future liabilities, and the unclarity of relinquishment process. I think in the old days it was they went broke. That was the process. So, Mr. Morris, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and you actually started dovetailing right into my next question, which was going to be, I noted that there was kind of some, further to the duplication point, I was going to kind of ask you, like, are there things that you think GNWT could be doing less of? And I think you've kind of gotten into that question a bit, but in terms of identifying gaps, you kind of named one. I'm curious, like, are there areas that you think GNWT should be, aside from this relinquishment process, are there areas that you think GNWT should be focusing on more that are actually under their jurisdiction and they should be paying more attention to and ensuring that, that is taken care of?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Mr. Wheeler?
I'll see, Mr. Chair. There probably are more. That's one specific one, I guess, around the relinquishment. There's also, there's also the form of security, if we wanted to stay with talking about reclamation, like the form of security in legislation, like the board sets the security through the evidence-based process based on what everyone thinks and everyone says and what it would actually cost to, move truckloads of rock and things like that. But then the minister and GNWT is responsible for determining the form of the security. Is it insurance policy? Is it, IOU like the old days? Is it cash? Is it whatever? And so that's another important piece. And I think sort of fairly shortly after devolution, there was a bit of a process that GNWT went through to kind of review that specifically, like forms of security. Is it okay to have insurance policies instead of cash or bank letters and things like that? I feel like that's still a live issue because like the numbers are big and the decision around the form of security can affect, cash flow for companies. The flip side is like, we need to be confident that these sites are going to be cleaned up and that the money is, accessible. And we don't, but the details of that, I think it seems like there's some flexibility around it, so that's an area that's sort of squarely within GNWT responsibility. Otherwise, like, other suggestion is on like managing the regulations themselves. Like these, the water regs are, NWT legislation, and so we have the process in place now with the Intergovernmental Council under the Intergovernmental Agreement to, manage or do kind of like maintenance work. We don't have to just do big projects that take multiple years to review, big pieces of legislation. We should be also able to be nimble and say, oh, there's a problem. Like we have, 3 or 4 discussions over the last 18 months about, water use for ice bridges, or about water use for drill recirculation, or about are there even supposed to be water licenses for small mineral exploration projects? But these are things that are totally within, GNWT and Indigenous governments together control, but it does need GNWT to be, willing partner and a leader on sort of openness to do that. It's a different kind of approach, I think, than what we're used to dealing with regulations. The idea that you could be nimble and make little changes. It doesn't have to be like a big deal. If there's 3 problems, it's just unclear. We all agree on it. The boards, through their regulatory process and like sort of pursuit of, continuous improvement, identify things that are like giving them headaches and giving industry and everyone headaches, make suggestions. We sit down as governments and say, yeah, that's silly. It's an unclear definition. What do we actually mean? let's write that into the regulation, and that, you know, that should be like a process that takes months. If the issues are, if it's targeted, and, you know, if there's sort of broad agreement around what we're trying to do. So that's another one that I think is really, really important and a huge opportunity for GNWT specifically. We'll see.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Ms. Shauna, then Ms. Reed, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I just want to say, Mussy, for laying out so clearly for us what is at stake here. I think sometimes, you know, we skip ahead to the details, but we miss out on just fully taking in that what is at stake is a treaty relationship and treaty-based, constitutionally based co-management systems. So thank you for just sort of laying it out there of what we're really talking about and what's at stake. A question I have, and it follows up a little bit on the conversation we were just having about opportunities to be nimble. I think there's always this struggle and tension within regulatory systems. I think, Ichwa, you mentioned at some point in your presentation that the board needs more flexibility to decide how to approach each project, sort of more freedom, more power in that way. But at the same time, I think many proponents are asking for clarity, right? Like, we need to know ahead of time exactly what to expect. We need the categories to be clear, the rules to be clear. And so there's this tension between needing flexibility and nimbleness and then needing sort of rules to be really like spelled out exactly so everyone knows exactly and everyone's treated exactly the same and treated fairly. But I wonder if you can give sort of your thoughts on how you want to strike that right balance, like, or on what specific areas the board needs to be needs more flexibility around, and sort of contrast that with areas that need to be spelled out much more clearly, if that makes sense. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Looking for a volunteer. Ms. Scott Enns, why don't you start off and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. Thank you, Shauna. So I think where there needs to be certainty and definition is what's written in paper in the regulations, right? Like, especially around mineral exploration, providing some clarity of definitions and certainty around what level of regulation is intended for mineral exploration. But it's really upon the boards to set out the appropriate process and level of regulation based on evidence for each project. So it's their job to do that assessment and then follow what's written on paper as defined by us collaboratively. Does that help clarify? Did you want to add anything, Brett?
No, I'll go to Ms. You can add more if you want, so I'll go back to Ms. Shauna. Ms. Morgan, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sure. Well, I'll ask a second question, but if other members of the presentation team have other things to add, that would be good too. But on one of the earlier slides, you mentioned the challenge around political influences. I don't know if I need to sort of figure out the exact slide, but I wonder if you could explain what was meant by that particular challenge, or if you have any examples. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Looking for a friendly face or a volunteer. I'm not. No, it's fine. I'm sure they know what they were referencing. So I'm still looking for a volunteer who wants to take the question on. Default? Okay, Ms. Scott Enns, you've been volunteered.
Oh,
Thank
actually,
you.
I'm going to volunteer my pal Brett beside me here. Turn it over to Brett. Thanks.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair. I think what we were discussing about political influences is mostly kind of an awareness, not necessarily that there's a problem, but that there's potential for political influence. So mainly we're thinking about, this is kind of a reminder of the objective. And the objective of the boards for optimum benefit and so on is set in the treaty. That that can't change. That doesn't change with the next Tlicho Assembly and the next Chiefs Executive Council. That doesn't change with, you know, the next government in Ottawa or the next government here. That's set. It is what it is. And the boards work, you know, to implement the regulations and stuff like that, but in a way that's consistent with that objective. It's solid, it's there. Whereas political ideas can change, you know, from government to government or, you know, time to time. And, you know, examples in the past, we shared a few about, you know, the damage and the environmental liability and things like that, that came from kind of a too permissive or a too passive approach, political approach to say, you know, yeah, we want these mines and we're not going to worry about what comes after or what comes next. But, you know, political winds could shift the other way and say, you know, and go to a heavier over-regulation and a very risk-averse approach and say we don't tolerate any risk at all, and so set a bar so high that like no project could meet it, or most, you know, 90% of projects would be scared off by that and decide not to even apply because they don't have like a reasonable prospect of getting, you know, what's seen generally as like an environmentally responsible project approved. So that's kind of what I mean about political influences. Like those winds can change, but we have something here that's constitutionally mandated that sort of is solid in terms of working for the optimum benefit. And what that means and how you get to balance of conservation and development, that can change over time, and within governments and between governments we can have those conversations. But they're under that umbrella, and we always, like Tammy said, like when we talk about land and water permitting, we need to remember like where this comes from and what did the governments already think about and write down together. So that always needs to be our starting place. So that's what we meant.
Okay. Thank you for that. Ms. Reid, I have you next, and then we'll see how time works for all members, if they want to jump back in, or are we in the right spot at that point? Ms. Reid, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really a wonderful framework, as Shauna was saying earlier, to remember that this is the ground that we're standing on, and we're all treaty people, and it's really something I think we need to continue to always have in co-management conversations. In your slide around continuing collaboration, you mentioned, you touched a little bit on that we need to strengthen collaborative approaches at all levels, including the Legislative Assembly, not just the GNWT. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what your perspective is on that. I'm assuming it would probably have to do with regulatory development, legislative development through Intergovernmental Council, but I'd love to hear you expand more on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Ms. Scott Enns, if you would lead us off, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I can start and then I'll see if Brett has anything to add. So the Legislative Assembly Convention protocols are relatively new, right? They were signed by the leaders, I think, last April. And so the Forest Act was really the first time they were used. And we haven't even really had an opportunity yet at the Intergovernmental Council to sit down and really have like a lessons learned conversation about how that process went, using them and implementing them together for the very first time. And so I think that's where, you know, there probably are some areas that we could learn from having used them for the first time and think about how to improve and strengthen them. So that's something we've been discussing at the Intergovernmental Council table, is doing that, having that discussion and talking about those lessons learned. But I do think that in general, I will say, like, it's amazing that we've achieved that we have that in place. You know, of course, we're always going to continue to look into how we can strengthen it, but the work that's been done on legislative and collaborative legislative development through IGC is also informing the whole of the GNWT. Like, we're taking those best practices and those protocols and those steps and applying them now to legislation much broader than land and resource management. And so that work is so important because it's blazing the trails for how we collaborate as governments on legislation across all areas. And for example, even the development of the UNDRIP legislation last year, right? That was a really collaborative development process, but that collaboration happened because we already had a good understanding of what collaboration on legislative development should look like.
Mr. Wheeler, you had some, please.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think the opportunity is for the Legislative Assembly to, receive proposals from government that are much stronger and much more sort of like, much more comprehensive in terms of reflecting the Indigenous governments and GWT's priorities, and making sure that, from the outset you're consistent with principles and priorities like reconciliation and implementing treaties and moving forward together. So that's one. But then there's also this continuity element that comes a little bit with the legislative process convention, right? That the interface, like, the Forest Act examples were, the interface was like, I don't know, we could call it small, or I don't know how to characterize it, but we had discussions like this about the act and actually went through like changes to the legislative proposal, kind of like in advance in collaboration with the committee and Intergovernmental Council and the minister. So that, I think, is an opportunity to bring just that continuity of the collaboration that happened sort of before or outside the Legislative Assembly process, but to bring that in and have the whole Legislative Assembly involved, like to the extent, and similar to like what we do at IGC, it's like to the extent that it, there's a desire or a need or that it makes sense for legislation at hand. And maybe there's other ways to do it or other ways to improve that process, but seems like a good start.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Ms. Kate, anything further on this? Okay, not a problem. I'll just squeeze in a quick one and check with other members. We're hearing some really good feedback. Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I was curious on your context around capacity. So, for example, we'll hear some folks say, when I say folks, I'm referring to Indigenous government partners, saying that they want to reply or respond or be part of the process, when called upon for consultation, but they either don't have the time or the skills in-house to be able to do this, and hence there's the appearance, of not being a willing partner, just, be part of the solution or part of the opportunity. And in some ways, I could read further into that, saying that is not the case, and I feel comfortable to that. So they're restrained by being a full participant, by not being able to participate due to financial capacity or skills and expertise. And are you finding this is, are you finding in any form, outside of the fact that we could always use more money, we could always use more staff, but are you finding that your current capacity is able to meet the needs and demands of some of these applications and requests in a reasonable way? Thank you. So I'm not sure who wants to be volunteered.
I just actually
I can speak on it a bit.
No?
Yeah, I was going to defer to
Okay.
Tammy for that one.
Yes, please, if you would. Thank you.
Always more money and more staff would definitely help the work that we're doing. As we stated in our presentation, we review about 200 applications that are coming forward. And what we're doing is the best that we can with what we have. And there's times where we are struggling in terms of capacity because there's many other files that relate to regulatory in particular that we're also need to have eyes on. Our regulatory department is one of our smallest divisions within the Department of Culture and Lands Protection. And but at the same time, we value our land and our waters so much. It's so ingrained that we do have to put forward all that we can to ensure that we have eyes and ears on these files. So definitely, if we're able to get more funding, more capacity, we're not going to say no, and it gets challenging. And I can see how for other Indigenous governments this could be a big issue. I'm not sure how to help them in that area, But for us, with the Tlicho government, we're doing the best that we can, and at times it is a big struggle. I'm not sure if Brett or Intuan would like to add.
Thank you. I look to our witnesses before I go back to members. Anything further? Ms. Scott, if you would.
Yeah, I'll just add from the perspective of my department, which like we work in one area that is very related and interconnected to the whole of the process, but outside of, the regulatory process itself, but even just around like the engagement, the relationship building with the private sector, with mining and exploration companies, the negotiations that has to happen. I'm responsible for negotiating impact and benefit and exploration agreements. We don't have an ITI department like GNWT does, right? We are working hard to bring together the right people to the table to make sure we can have good conversations that are productive and well-informed by experts. But there is for us a need around capacity building within our government for being able to lead all of that work that really supports and is tied to the regulatory process and tied to economic development and taking care of the land, and is really important, but is not sort of embedded in the funding that exists and the process that exists to have sort of those resources readily available to support negotiations and networking and relationship building and all of that.
Very good. Yeah, I should be fair. I wasn't trying to encourage to create a blank check situation, but my worry is an example, and I can appreciate more resources are always welcome. My worry from my question perspective is if someone's applying for a water license and no one has the time to review the application, or someone doesn't have the expertise to review the application, it gets delayed, and hence that's creating finger pointing unnecessarily, but in the sense of appreciation, wanting to be a willing partner, etc. So that's more so where I was coming from, because I wouldn't want people unnecessarily or unfairly pointing the finger at folks in the sense of without us understanding some of the problem in essence, and sometimes it can be supported and fixed very easily, and that's part of the process of what we're trying to do here today. Members, do we have any further questions? And we're approaching the clock here shortly, so I'll just run around the room. I'll start with Mr. Morse, and if people want to squeeze in one question and maybe a clear follow-up if necessary, and that way we can try to get as many robust questions in. Mr. Morse.
Yeah, thanks. For respect to time, I'll just stick to one. So something that's been noted during this review by other parties, I think it may have been touched upon by yourselves a bit, is just that there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding out there of the unique co-management system that we have here in the NWT. And it's been pointed out to me quite a bit that the boards have done a lot of work in this regard, and the Wikisi Land and Water Board, the MVLWB, the boards in general, put out a lot of material on kind of how the system works and how to navigate the system. And yet, there still seems to be this significant amount of confusion about the system. So I'm curious to hear from the TG's perspective, how do you feel we can address this problem? And specifically, what should GNWT be doing, and how do you see them, or us, I suppose, in that picture? Are there things that you think, are there gaps that could be filled there? Is there more that could be done in terms of promoting and helping to develop a better understanding of the system to kind of improve system navigation? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Great question. Looking for a volunteer. Mr. Wheeler?
Merci, Mr. Chair, merci, Julian, for the question. There are some misunderstandings. I think my sense is that it's been getting better over time, although maybe it's sort of slower than we would like, or there's hiccups, I guess, along the way sometimes. I think when a couple of things. I do want to give like a shout out to some of the promotional efforts that GNWT does in collaboration with Indigenous governments at things like Roundup and PDAC and things like that that are specific to the mineral industry. And I think those events that I've been attending off and on for 15 years or so have improved. The message is more coherent, and the purpose of those events, which is supposed to be promotional, is I don't know. It's just more of a focus now. Like we don't need or want to like get in a room at promotional events and sort of complain about, you know, the difficulties that we have. There's a place for that. We can have rooms for that, and we do have some, right? And we want to work through those things. But we need to sort of think about our purpose for each sort of venue or each communication that we're having. So I think that has been improving. Like in the past, we just had some venting sessions basically, and you know, if you watch the back of the room, like it doesn't take long for the investors to walk out. So those are much better, I would say, in recent years. And then the other one is like, sometimes we have like chains of communication that turn into like games of telephone a little bit. And even when they're really good games of telephone, things still get lost a little bit or misinterpreted along the way. So as much as possible, when we're trying to inform people and educate them about the system, we should make those conversations direct as possible. So if someone wants to come do an activity that requires a land use permit, well, they need to go and talk to the regulator that issues land use permits. And if they want other advice about mineral claims, or if they want some general stuff, then that's fine. They could talk to someone else. But I think encouraging that as direct as possible communication. You got a big project and you're going to have an environmental assessment, you might as well talk to the environmental assessment board. So that would be a couple things that I want to mention, but direct communication is one of them, I think. And also just to like recognize too, like some of the improvements. Like we had a lot of new people coming and looking for lithium the last couple of years, and most of them, you know, had a pretty smooth time. Like they were pretty happy, and they gave pretty good feedback about, oh, thanks, you know, people are really helpful here, and the process seems really simple, and all this kind of stuff. So we need to kind of like remember those, because sometimes we get stuck on like a few examples where there were upsets and a small approval took a ridiculously long amount of time and was so complicated installed. But so just to step back and make sure we tell the story of like what usually happens is things go pretty smooth and it is pretty predictable. And we have efficiencies like already, like we do preliminary screenings and land use permitting and water licensing at the same time. You know, in Nunavut, that's a separate process. You do one at a time, not simultaneous. So there's some examples like that we should just remember and communicate about those too. Awesome.
Thank you. Not seeing anyone else at this second. I just wanted to ask maybe if, in the context of the phrase co-management, okay, that's all I'm asking about, okay? Do you find that's an intimidating phrase for non-Northerners? I mean, we can say that's collaborative management and a whole bunch of other types of semantics, which all really keep coming back to the same thing. But do you ever find that that's an intimidating challenge for those who aren't familiar? Because, I mean, if you went to Nevada to do a job, or you went to Sydney to do a job, or Mongolia, you don't hear the phrase co-management, you just hear regime, you know, whatever the regime is. And do you think that from your perspective has a, because it was brought up by Mr. Morris there, and it got me thinking when in the description of your answer there, is sometimes the title co-management, do you think it's causing frustration, blockage, or confusion from industry? In a sense? Maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Not from what we have seen. I would say for us, co-management is really like a indication of the very important and unique context we have in the Northwest Territories, that these are Indigenous lands and that our system is rooted in Indigenous ways of life and decision making. So I think for us, co-management has always been a positive thing, and even that term, I don't think we've seen sort of the same reaction to the word itself.
Okay. No problem. The way it was described by the member's question and the answer, I was just curious when Southern people are approaching work. I'm not referring to a Northern perspective looking south. I'm referring to a Southern perspective. Feeling that the system is complicated, et cetera, and hearing, oh, two systems when you say co-managing. It's really one. So I go to Emily Morgan, maybe for the final question, unless something stirs members that we really have to get onto the record. Ms. Morgan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just reflecting on the fact that, I mean, you've come here with a pretty clear message of some things that, you know, you're frustrated about and want to change, and it does seem that you're working through various, you know, working groups at IGC and other places. Do you feel that, like, I'm sure you've tried to bring this message into other forums, right? When you're talking to GNWT or other people. Do you feel that message is being heard? Are the right people at the tables? Like, when you've brought this message about what your suggestions are and recommendations and frustrations, what has been the response in the past? Are you talking to the right people? Or, you know, why haven't we seen movement on these issues before now? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Ms. Scott Enns, do you want to lead us off, or 1 second? Okay, when you're ready. Please.
Yeah, sorry, just trying to think how to frame this. We have been having these conversations in all the forums that we work within, leadership level, staff level, with the departments, with other governments. It's really important to us, as you guys have heard today. I do think there is some continued work to be done to make sure that people really understand what it means when we say it and the significance of it. And I think that learning is still perhaps happening, and also like trying to hear that, and understand how to uphold and implement that, while also implementing, I think, GWT's responsibility. That's where some of the tensions maybe happen. But we are really pushing this conversation because it's really important to us. Like, I can't emphasize that enough. One of the things that Tammy and I could both tell you about is how important the land where the diamond mines are to our own families. That are, you know, my grandfather used to have a trap line that went right where the diamond mine is now. And when the diamond mines came north in the 90s, he got very involved in helping to inform, like, what plants were there and, you know, the environment there, to make sure that it would return to the way it was, because that land was so important to our family. And so that was around the same time when we were negotiating the Tlicho agreement, right? Like, that was the significance of what was happening and the changes that were happening with having people come north, and this development to happen in the places where our families have lived and harvested, and where our stories are, where our language come from. Like, that has always been that way for us, and all of a sudden this change was happening. And so that's really like the root of where the co-management system came from and why it was negotiated. Because literally our families can tell you where they were born in those areas, and where the caribou walk, and, you know, where that happened when they were a kid, and, you know, where to get the good fish, and where to set the trap lines. Those are things that is not ancient memory for us. That's still very alive. And so the co-management system was our people's way of making sure that we had continued ability to make decisions no matter what change was coming our way on the lands that our people have depended on since time immemorial. The, I think, significance of what that means to Tlicho people, and probably to other Indigenous groups, for non-Indigenous people doing these roles in government, I'm certain that is a steep learning curve, even if you are committed to reconciliation and good Indigenous relations. It's really important point to really understand how important the decisions that government makes in developing regulations, policies, and laws trickles down and has impacts on our families. And so that piece, I think there's still a lot more work to do to ensure that every department, every level of government We know the Premier has acknowledged the significance of the role of Indigenous governments, that these are Indigenous lands, that the role of GNWT will evolve in the future over time. That's great, and that leadership needs to trickle down to the deputy ministers, to the assistant deputy ministers, and to every government official and technical expert that works underneath them.
Thank you for your,
If I can add,
yes, please.
and it also goes to the previous question related to co-management. When we look at the agreement, I've had people come to me, especially around caribou harvesting time, especially way up in the Wik-Aji area, and suggest that, you know, Tlicho government need to say other people that are non-treaty 11 shouldn't be in that area. And I said, that's not how our agreement is written. And that's not what our elders had wanted for the land. And this is where the co-management, when we talk about co-management, we're talking about meaning working together and finding that balance. And when we're talking about the land and taking care of it, that's what we're drilling down to. How can we all, everybody that's using the land, have good roles and responsibilities that in the end, the land, the environment, the wildlife is there for our future generations to also benefit from. So today, when we're working on the land, when we're working with other Indigenous governments or industry, whoever, everybody, we have to hold each other accountable. That's what this is all about. And by holding each other accountable, knowing who has which roles and which responsibility. And again, holding each other accountable for that so that there's no misinformation, miscommunication, misunderstanding, so that we all know which role we play and what we need to do so that the pieces fit nicely together. It's really important. I feel though that now, if we look back in comparison to how things were in the 80s and the 90s, things are better, much better, but there's still room for improvement. Merci.
Thank you very much. So folks, unless anyone has a burning last question, I'm just going to close this off. Not seeing anything from the floor. That said, I want to stress that committee's objective is to help bring value, add value, and sometimes that just means being nimble on clarity on issues. I don't think anyone's suggesting a full rewrite of anything, but I mean, there's always a better way of doing things. It doesn't mean full changes or whatnot. It's not to strip away from the process. It's just to make it better, work better with what we've got. That said, I want to thank the Tlicho government for your time and energy today, your energy in the presentation, the time you've taken to put the presentation together, and the value you're bringing to our work. So thank you, everyone. And at this particular point, I'll call the committee meeting and the hearing to a close. And I wish everyone a sincere thank you and a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Merci.